When people are disciplined in following the wrong dietary advice, they don't get better.
Have you heard of fat fasts?
I have prescribed fat fasts for people in the past. Yeah.
Dr. Chris Palmer is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist and the best-selling author of Brain Energy.
And is on a mission to fix your brain and your mental health.
You know, you mentioned Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. Actually, in many cases, the very first sign of a problem is not memory impairment. It's actually depression or anxiety. So serotonin is one of the key neurotransmitters implicated in depression and anxiety disorders in particular. And in fact, 90 to 95% of the serotonin in the human body is produced in the gut. The bottom line is I actually do know what it's like to have a really severe mental illness myself. I was living in a homeless shelter when I first started high school. I became severely depressed over time. They put me on all sorts of medicines, and none of that actually worked for me. In a last-ditch effort, I decided to try the Atkins diet, which is really a ketogenic diet. And within 3 months, not only did I get rid of my metabolic syndrome, but my mental health improved dramatically.
So if people want to increase their ketones, that means that they should increase their fat. Is that correct?
It really depends. So they're kind of 2 or 3 magic numbers. The ketones can go too high.
This episode features Dr. Chris Palmer, a Harvard-trained psychiatrist who is revolutionizing the way that we fix our brain and our mental health. Now, this episode was personal for me because I suffered from a mental health disorder from a very young age, and it was a high-fat nutritional protocol that ultimately saved me. So if you're learning from and enjoying these free episodes, please hit the subscribe button because it's doctors like Dr. Chris Palmer and all the other experts that we have on this channel that will ultimately help you, your loved ones, and your family fix their brain and ultimately their health. So if you want to be part of the 21% of people that have already subscribed, this will help share the message to millions more people that need to hear the truth. And now for the episode with Dr. Chris Palmer. Dr. Palmer, welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here.
When many of us think about what destroys the brain, we mostly think about diseases like Alzheimer's, dementia, and Parkinson's. We really don't think about mental health disorders like depression, anxiety, and ADHD as destroying the brain. And they do. And if you're watching this, you have over 50% chance of getting a mental health disorder without even knowing it. So in this episode, Dr. Palmer is going to share his 27 years of clinical experience and talk about the brain, how these mental health disorders are closely linked to the foods that we're eating every single day, and something that we're consuming every day that is slowly destroying your brain. So Dr. Palmer, my first question. You are a Harvard-trained psychiatrist. Do you think that mental illnesses like depression, anxiety, even ADHD, are they as dangerous as Alzheimer's and dementia?
So it's a really important question. And I think the first caveat is that it really depends on how we define a mental health disorder. And the conundrum in our field and among the population is that most of the symptoms of mental health disorders are normal, expected human reactions in the right circumstances. So, for example, depression is normal when it occurs at the right time and under the right circumstances. So all of us really have been depressed at some point or another during our lives. I don't mean clinical depression. I don't mean 2 weeks of unrelenting depression, but I mean all of us have experienced depression. When we experience disappointment or loss or grief or other things, we are hardwired as organisms to experience depression. Same with anxiety, same with lots of other symptoms, including ones like paranoia. Like, even though a lot of people don't think that can be normal, if you've ever watched a really terrifying movie that really made you terrified, and then somebody made you walk through the dark house alone, you were probably a little bit or a lot of bit paranoid. You were probably looking around the corner, worrying about what was in the closet. If you heard anything creak, you probably got terrified that, oh my gosh, is it the boogeyman from the movie? So these are all normal human responses to certain circumstances. And yet they can all be mental disorders when they are occurring for prolonged periods of time in extreme ways or for no reason at all, when they are occurring for no clear logical reason. And so back to your question, so the first category, I would just consider mental states is what I kind of call them. And we all experience them. There's nothing abnormal about them. But the second category are mental disorders, where our brains are actually malfunctioning and producing these experiences, sensations, thoughts for no clear reason. And when we have mental disorders, they are highly correlated with neurodegenerative, neuroprogressive disorders. And in some cases, you mentioned Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. Actually, in many cases, the very first sign of a problem is not memory impairment. For a lot of people, it's actually depression or anxiety. That if a 70-year-old person develops depression out of the blue for no clear reason, everybody needs to be worried that that may be the first sign of dementia in that person.
If somebody is just watching this and they're thinking, well, I don't want to get dementia, Alzheimer's, or Parkinson's, how do I know that something like depression or anxiety is something that is clinical or something that is everyday occurrence? What is the difference?
So most people know the difference. And the difference is whether the symptoms are occurring for clear, good reason or not. And so if you are depressed because for the last few months, because you're having stress in your relationship or at work, then there's a clear reason for that. And I wouldn't make too much of it. I would just give yourself grace and just acknowledge that you are human, that you're allowed to be a little bit down because life isn't going as perfectly as you would hope it would be. And give yourself time to work through those challenging situations and look for a point at which they resolve. And hopefully, if you can resolve those issues, your depression or anxiety or whatever will resolve. For other people, though, I think a lot of people who have chronic depression or anxiety, they actually know there's a problem. They will often come into my office and say, Dr. Palmer, I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know why I'm so depressed. I don't know why I'm so anxious. On the surface, I have a good life. Everything's going well. Like I haven't been this way before. Like I used to be happy. And then all of a sudden, like a year ago, I just started getting so depressed. Sometimes something triggered it. So a relationship breakup may have triggered the depression. And so early on, it was normal, understandable. But if it persists in an unrelenting, severe way for a year, most people understand this isn't normal anymore. What's wrong with me? All of my friends and family are telling me, snap out of it, that this isn't normal. Like most people get over it. Most people move on, and I just need to move on. But for some reason, I can't move on. I don't know what's wrong with me. I can't stop thinking about the person. I can't stop thinking about what a failure I am. And in those cases, when people are really questioning, why do I feel so poorly? Why am I having these symptoms? Why are they lasting so long? Especially when other people in your life are telling you, this isn't normal anymore. Like it was normal in the first, month or two, But now it like, come on, Chris, get over it. Like you need, move on. When you start hearing that from more and more people, then you do need to consider the possibility that you have depression, the brain disorder of depression. And what we know, even from large population studies, is that if you have chronic depression, even at a young age, it puts you at 2 to 3 times the risk for developing dementia later in life.
So, when we talk about people that have a prolonged experience of feeling down, anxious, I also want to cover ADHD because I think that is increasing in large folds. Let's talk about the ADHD first. Why do you think that is increasing?
So it is increasing a lot. So in the United States since 2010, the rates have tripled. And the rates since the pandemic are up even more. So that tripling statistic is actually only up until about 2020. There's a lot of controversy around that statistic. So one is there are a lot of people who think that we are just recognizing ADHD more commonly, that people have had ADHD forever and ever. And nobody paid attention to it before. Nobody diagnosed it before. People weren't aware of it. And so people were suffering. They didn't do as well in school as they could have. They didn't do as well at work as they could have. And now we're recognizing it. Now we're diagnosing it and treating it. So that's one theory. The second theory is there are a lot of people who think we are way overdiagnosing this ADHD stuff. We are just everybody has a little bit of inattention now and then. Nobody loves reading challenging textbooks or papers or other things. We all get a little bit distracted. And these psychiatrists are just kind of going crazy. They're going wild with like just, oh, you have a little bit of inattention. I'm going to diagnose you with ADHD and put you on a stimulant. So there's that camp that we are just wildly overdiagnosing ADHD. But there is a third theory. There are probably even many more. But the third theory that I'll talk about is that no, the rates are actually really increasing. And I actually believe all of those things have some degree of truth in them. Yes, there were people who didn't get diagnosed in the 1990s that maybe are getting diagnosed now. Yes, that is true. Are some clinicians way overdiagnosing ADHD? Yes, I think that's true too. But I believe the rates, in fact, are genuinely increasing, and that actually is the most prominent explanation for the increasing rates. And why and how that works starts to get complicated, and we can get into as much or as little of the science as you want. But the soundbite is that I believe mental disorders like ADHD are in fact metabolic disorders, and that as the rates of metabolic problems in society are skyrocketing in the forms of obesity and diabetes, prediabetes, so too will the brain be affected, and we will see increasing rates of ADHD. Now, one common argument is that, well, wait, ADHD, this is in kids, and most of these kids are not overweight or obese. And most of them don't have diabetes, Dr. Palmer. So what do you have to say to that? And what I have to say to that is that parents who have obesity and parents who have diabetes are much more likely to have children with neurodevelopmental disorders. And that includes ADHD and autism spectrum and other neurodevelopmental disorders. And so when we look at the statistics, how many pregnant women are now overweight or obese or diabetic? The rates are skyrocketing. And so logic, based on well-established, peer-reviewed science, decades of it, logic tells us that as the rates of obesity and diabetes skyrocket in our population, so too will the rates of neurodevelopmental disorders. These are real. These children are not doing anything wrong. This is not about blaming and shaming. And it's also not about blaming and shaming the parents. The parents are ill. The parents have metabolic illness. They often don't know what causes it. They don't know what they're doing wrong. And a lot of them actually really don't want to be overweight or diabetic. They really desperately want to be better. And we as society and as a healthcare field are doing an abysmal job of addressing these issues. And, but I do believe the rates of ADHD, back to your main point, rates of ADHD are in fact going up.
I think it's very important to understand that on the spectrum of mental health disorders, there are a variety of conditions that we're seeing ever increasing. So we've got anxiety, we've got the autism, the ADHD, OCD. There's so many different disorders, but they're coming down to a same root cause, which you describe as metabolic dysfunction. And we're going to talk about that, the science behind that, how that's connected to your mitochondria. I want to talk about neurotransmitters in the brain because that controls everything. But Dr. Palmer, you are a Harvard-trained psychiatrist. And it's quite interesting because you are arguably the expert when it comes to mental health in the brain, but you weren't so healthy as a child. Can you explain your story? And the reason for that is because I want to give people hope that no matter what they're going through, that they can survive. So we'd love to hear your story.
Sure. And happy to spend as much or as little time as you want on this. My story could take us hours and hours if you really want all the gory details, but I'll give you the quick version. So the quick version is I actually grew up in a middle class, maybe lower middle class family. We were a large Catholic family, 8 kids in our family. My father worked as a pharmacist, and my mom, he started a pharmacy when I was relatively young, and my mom worked in the pharmacy with him to just help him get the pharmacy started. When I was really young, I had OCD. It was never diagnosed. Nobody recognized it. I was just kind of the odd kid who had OCD. And I didn't know what it was. I didn't know that it was a problem or a disorder or anything else, but I had it. And I muddled along. I think I was kind of the awkward kid. I got bullied and teased a lot on the playground. And then when I was about 12 years old, some really horrible things happened in my mother's family. And she ended up having what she initially called a nervous breakdown and started with depression, quickly led to depression and suicidal thoughts. And then she developed psychotic symptoms. She came to believe that she was Mary Magdalene reincarnated, that the world was ending, and all of these really crazy things. She actually got psychiatric help, but it didn't work for her. And that actually made me really angry and frustrated with the mental health system. Like, why are these people not helping my mother? She's clearly got something wrong with her, and they're supposedly treating her, but she's not getting better. But her symptoms led to my parents getting a divorce. And then when they got divorced, my mom pretty much lost everything. She lost all her money. She lost custody of all 8 kids. And she was psychotic and suicidal. And I was horribly worried about her. I also never really got along with my father. So I ended up leaving home, and I went to live with her. We lived in a rooming house initially, and then we ran out of money because we weren't getting any money from the court orders for the divorce. And so we ended up homeless for a while. And I was living in a homeless shelter when I first started high school. And that led to many more severe kind of symptoms for me. I became severely depressed over time. suicidal, tried to kill myself many times. High school was just a mess for me. I actually ended up leaving home. My mom at some point made me go back and live with my dad, and I stayed with him for a short time, but then ended up leaving home before I even finished high school. And somehow, shockingly, I pulled myself together by college, got through college, did really well in college, and ended up getting into medical school. And I can keep going on, but yeah, the bottom line is I actually do know what it's like to have a really severe mental illness myself. I know what it's like to want to be dead repetitively. I remember one of the times I tried to kill myself. When I woke up the next morning, I took an overdose and just slept an extra long time and then woke up the next morning. And I remember as soon as I woke up and recognized I'm still alive, I was so angry at myself for not being able to kill myself. I was so disappointed that I wasn't dead. I was just disgusted. I was like, what the hell? I can't even do that right.
I think that is speaking to a lot of people because I don't think many people talk about this. I think it's very light conversations, and especially people are just feeling down, anxious, not feeling great. They'll probably go to their doctor, and I'm sure the doctor will prescribe some Zoloft, Prozac, probably try to make them feel better. But people don't actually talk about the real feelings that they go through in terms of the deep despair that even somebody like you, a Harvard trained psychiatrist, is feeling at that time. So it's important to understand these feelings are real, but there is a way to get out of it. What was the steps for you to change your life?
So I got psychiatric treatment at least a little bit through high school. I tried lots of different medications. I was hospitalized at one point because I was so suicidal. They put me on all sorts of medicines, and none of that actually worked for me. By the time I was in college, um, I was getting therapy that helped more. Um, in and then in medical school, I was back on medications because I was learning all about psychiatry and how chemical imbalances are the cause of depression and OCD. So I kind of realized, oh, I must need a pill. I need to try more pills because this is the answer. And I went on Prozac and some other medications, and Prozac helped a little bit, but it ended up coming with so many side effects for me. It completely messed up my sleep. I think I was gaining a little bit of weight from it. And then when I was in my residency at Harvard, I ended up developing metabolic syndrome. And I'll give you the short version. Year after year, the doctor's telling me diet and exercise. I'm on a super low fat diet and I'm exercising regularly and none of it's working. He didn't say anything about processed foods or that. Those are all fine. So I was eating Entenmann's baked goods, which are low fat, and those were supposed to be good for you because they didn't have any fat. And as long as it didn't have fat, it was supposed to be a health food. And that's what we were told. As ridiculous as that sounds today, that is actually what the doctors told me. And that is what most people in society thought back then. And unfortunately, that's still what some people think today. So getting more and more frustrated with my inability to lower my blood pressure, to improve my blood lipids, to improve my blood glucose. In a last-ditch effort, I decided to try the Atkins diet, which is really a ketogenic diet. And within 3 months, not only did I get rid of my metabolic syndrome, but my mental health improved dramatically. And that process it started a long journey, a 25-year journey for me that culminated in where I'm at now. But it started with my own personal experience and observation that, wow, changing my diet has dramatically improved my mental health in ways that I never would have even thought possible. And the change in diet allowed me to exercise kind of at a new level. Like I had been exercising, but it was always difficult because I just didn't have energy. I always lacked energy. And no matter what, I was still doing it. I was forcing myself to do it. I was disciplined. I was in medical school working like 36, 48-hour shifts. I was disciplined. So people who think, oh, it's just laziness and lack of discipline. No, it's not. No, I was actually really working hard, disciplined. When people are disciplined in following the wrong dietary advice, they don't get better. And when somebody gives them accurate advice that actually can improve their metabolic health, accurate nutrition plans and ideas about what can actually work, it can be life-changing. And that was it for me.
As Dr. Palmer mentions, what we eat is so important, not only to fix brain diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia, but also to fix your mental health. And Dr. Palmer has experienced tremendous benefits by following a ketogenic diet. And I'm sure that so many of you have experienced the same thing, even with a carnivore diet. But when you make this change by lowering your carbohydrates, you might experience some side effects like headache, nausea, or even fatigue. Now, all this is very, very normal, especially at the beginning. So what you can do to help is to add in some high quality salt. Salt your meals and salt your water. But if this doesn't help, I would highly recommend that you use electrolytes. And that's why I have LMNT as a sponsor of today's video. LMNT produces high quality electrolytes that has the right mix of sodium, potassium, and magnesium. And I use LMNT because I predominantly follow a carnivore diet. And the great thing about LMNT is that it contains nothing artificial. There's no nasties, there's no preservatives, there is no additives. And I like to use the raw unflavored option every morning in my morning coffee. And my husband likes the watermelon salt, and more recently, the chocolate salt as it's getting closer to winter. And LMNT has also launched their new sparkling water range. And right now, LMNT is offering this free sample pack on every order. So you're going to get 8 single servings of LMNT to try for free. So if you want this, just head to drinklmnt.com/the Primal Podcast. I want to talk about the brain because if people can understand how the brain works and what energizes the brain, not just the mitochondria, other things, they can understand where these mood disorders come from and then how what you eat is a pivotal part of fixing a lot of mental health disorders. So the first question for you is, you say that mental health disorders, whether it be ADHD, anxiety, OCD, autism, anything on the list, they are metabolic disorders of the brain. That sounds a bit complicated. Can you try to explain what that is?
The real answer is it is complicated. If you want to understand the details of the science, it is complicated. But to take a step back, a lot of times when people hear the word metabolic or metabolism, they think about diet and they think about burning calories. And metabolism is actually so much more than that. Metabolism is about all of this, the processes, the pathways that our cells use to make energy and to create building blocks that get used to make new cell parts or grow new cells. That is all metabolism. And so in that sense, metabolism is biology. Metabolism is foundational to biology. You don't have biology, which is the study of living organisms. You don't have that without metabolism, because part of the definition of what is a living organism is metabolism. And actually, when humans die, in every case, there are no exceptions to this rule, death is defined by the absence of metabolism. That is what determines whether we are alive or dead. And that's why if somebody suffocates you and you don't have oxygen, you lack metabolism, your metabolism stops. And so metabolism is foundational to the function of cells. And so, not surprisingly, disruptions in metabolism or dysregulation of metabolism can result in the dysfunction of cells. So, again, I'm arguing that if you have depression for clear reasons, we're just hardwired. That's you being human. That's not you having a brain disorder. But when you have depression for no good reason, that may represent your brain malfunctioning. And the ultimately, all roads of cellular dysfunction lead to metabolic dysfunction. There's just almost no way around it. It's kind of a universal principle in biology. And this theory doesn't replace things like neurotransmitter imbalances. It actually helps us understand how and why would neurotransmitters ever become imbalanced. It helps us understand what are the consequences of neurotransmitter imbalances. But it's not just neurotransmitters, it's hormones, it's inflammation, but it's also psychological and social things. We have tremendous evidence that trauma, stress, childhood adversity all impact metabolic function, and more specifically, mitochondria. And so the metabolic theory of mental illness is not about inventing a wild theory out of thin air. Instead, the metabolic theory of mental illness is about integrating over a century of scientific evidence, putting all of the puzzle pieces that we have, the biopsychosocial model of mental illness. How does that all fit together? It all fits together through what we call metabolism.
Absolutely. I want to break it down so that people can understand, even high level, how they are kind of connected to each other and then actionable points that they need to do. So we're going to talk about one by one. I want to first talk about the mitochondria, which is your metabolic, I guess, fuel or functioning of every cell, but it does other things in the cell. Can you explain the mitochondria, why that's important, especially in brain function?
Yeah. So most people, if they've ever heard of mitochondria, it's probably been in biology class, maybe in high school or college, maybe even elementary school. And if you heard of it in biology class, you probably heard the phrase powerhouse of the cell. And that is true. Mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell. Our cells actually have multiple mitochondria, usually hundreds of them in each cell. Sometimes thousands of them in larger cells or long cells. And what the powerhouse of the cell means is that they take food and convert it into ATP, which is the power of the cell. That is kind of the energy source for cells. There is no doubt that function is true, and mitochondria continue to be powerhouses of the cell. But here's the deal. Cutting edge research over the last 20 years has completely shattered that simplistic definition. Mitochondria are so much more than powerhouses. Who knew? This is why you didn't learn it in biology class, because they didn't know it probably when you took biology class. They didn't know it when I took biology class. So it's not that our teachers were inappropriately teaching us. They just didn't know. But if you search the medical or biological literature, you will see tens of thousands of research articles on the extraordinary world of mitochondria and all of the different functions they do. And the reason these functions are so important is because they can help us understand so many things that we have long known play a role in mental illness. They control the production, regulation, and release of neurotransmitters, including things like serotonin, dopamine, GABA, glutamate. They control the epigenetics, the gene expression in the cell nucleus. They play a profound role in turning inflammation both on and off. They play a role in stress responses, and stress and trauma kind of play out through mitochondrial functions. They play a role in how hungry we are. They play a role in whether we have energy to exercise. They play a role in hormone production. They control the first step in the synthesis of some key hormones, including cortisol, estrogen, testosterone, progesterone. And guess what? Those play a role in mental illness. So again, the metabolic theory, the mitochondrial theory of mental illness isn't about replacing all of those things. It's about how do we fit together inflammation and epigenetic changes and neurotransmitters and trauma and stress. They all intersect and unite through mitochondria.
Okay, so let's talk about the connection, and we're going to go again piece by piece through everything that you mentioned, but the mitochondria and the connection to neurotransmitters, because they are the chemical messages that tell the body and the brain of maybe how you feel. Can we talk about the main neurotransmitters that is responsible for mood and energy, and then how that gets disrupted?
So the real answer is it gets complicated fast, and it's all a circle. And so most people like to think in terms of linear kind of logic. And so you're saying, and the serotonin gets imbalanced and then that causes bad mood. No, I'm saying serotonin and mitochondrial dysfunction can result in serotonin imbalances, but then serotonin imbalances can cause more mitochondrial dysfunction, and then it becomes a vicious cycle. And those vicious cycles are important because they help us understand why so many disorders can become chronic and unrelenting, because people get trapped in this cycle. And so we'll focus on serotonin. So serotonin is one of the key neurotransmitters implicated in depression and anxiety disorders in particular. Why? Because not because of basic science research showing serotonin imbalances, because those studies have been done, and guess what? We don't appear to have serotonin imbalances. It's not an imbalance of serotonin, but what it is that the medications that can increase the activity of serotonin seem to alleviate depression. So how does that work? So it turns out that serotonin is actually not just a brain neurotransmitter. Serotonin flows throughout our bloodstream. It is located throughout our entire body. And in fact, 90 to 95% of the serotonin in the human body is produced in the gut. And then it can get absorbed. So serotonin is actually produced from key molecules as part of the Krebs citric acid cycle. And so mitochondria are the ones doing that. So mitochondria are processing food, and some of those processes essentially make up the building blocks for serotonin. But then serotonin, interestingly, flows throughout the brain and body. And when it's flowing throughout the body, at least, it appears to get absorbed into seemingly all mitochondria. And then it gets converted into a molecule called melatonin. So most people know melatonin because that's the sleep thing, or that's the circadian rhythm thing that you might take for jet lag. And yes, it is that thing. But the majority of melatonin in the human body is actually not kind of released by the pineal gland in our brain for sleep regulation. The overwhelming majority of melatonin in our body is located within mitochondria, and it is coming from serotonin. So serotonin, at the end of the day, is less about mood, and it is much, much more about mitochondria and metabolism. And it's located, serotonin is found in numerous organisms, all the way from worms to humans. And it is a primary regulator of metabolism, metabolic function, mitochondrial function. And so when we think about medications that modulate serotonin, we need to think about it in those ways that it's less about the serotonin and a serotonin imbalance, and it's more about what impact serotonin can have on mitochondria and metabolism.
Okay, I think I have that as an understanding. So it's not about one correlates to another. It's not linear. It is a kind of circular motion that things affect different things. Serotonin is not just in the brain. What about other neurotransmitters like dopamine, GABA, glutamate, adenosine, all these? So where does that fit in the picture of us being diagnosed with a mental health disorder?
So all of the neurotransmitters are really regulators of metabolism. And so I want you to, first and foremost, we think about neurotransmitters as chemicals that go between brain cells and send messages. That part is true. I'm not arguing with that. Yes, neurotransmitters go between brain cells and send messages. But what exactly are the messages? The messages are to increase or decrease metabolism in the target cells. That is what they're doing. What creates those messages, interestingly, is so hugely dependent on mitochondria. So glutamate, which is actually the primary excitatory neurotransmitter in the human nervous system. So it's the most prominent neurotransmitter that makes things happen, stimulates other neurons or other tissues. That glutamate is actually part of the Krebs citric acid cycle. It is being produced in mitochondria. It is part of energy production process, but sometimes it comes out and then gets released as a neurotransmitter. And although we think of it as a neurotransmitter, sometimes it can actually serve as a fuel source in other cells. So glutamate is part of the Krebs citric acid cycle, is intimately related to and directly controlled by mitochondria. Glutamate gets turned into GABA, which is this other neurotransmitter that you talked about. So glutamate gets converted into GABA. So GABA levels depend on glutamate levels from the mitochondria. And so you can start to see how it becomes a complicated domino effect over time. And I don't need people to understand the details of this. You can go look it up if you really want to. It's like right there. You just Google it and you'll find out how is GABA produced, and you'll find all the enzymes and everything else you want. But for our purposes, with the metabolic theory of mental illness, it's just important to kind of think about neurotransmitters in a different way. This theory I'm not asking people to completely forget everything they know about neurotransmitters. What I'm asking people to do is think more deeply about where are these neurotransmitters coming from in the first place. You're going to be led to mitochondria an awful lot. And then what are these neurotransmitters doing to other cells? Like what actually happens to that other cell when that neurotransmitter binds to its receptor? You're going to come to mitochondria an awful lot because that cell is either going to be more active or less active. And that means more mitochondrial activity or less mitochondrial activity, because mitochondria are kind of the engine of the cell, if you will. And so we're really talking about regulating cell activity by regulating the metabolism of those cells. And ultimately, that's what the neurotransmitters are doing. And so again, it's a cycle. So a neurotransmitter imbalance, if one exists, could cause metabolic dysfunction or mitochondrial dysfunction or dysregulation in its target cells. But if those target cells, if you have cells that are supposed to be releasing or producing neurotransmitters or, stimulating more activity of neurotransmitters. If you have dysregulation there, then there might be dysregulation. So the overarching theme of mental illness is that the brain isn't working right. The brain is supposed to be this well-oiled, fine-tuned, amazingly fine-tuned machine that is so precise, that is so specific to our environment. That is what the brain is primed to do. The brain is primed for our environment, to go out, to learn, to remember, to experience, to love, to eat, to drink, to reproduce, to do all these fun things. But the brain is ultimately designed for that, to take us as organisms through the world, to interact with others, to survive, to fight, to do everything we need to do to make the most of our lives. And what I'm arguing is that mental disorders are when there is dysregulation or dysfunction of brain circuits that result in symptoms that are really kind of concerning. They cause suffering, they cause impairment of functioning. And at the end of the day, there really is almost no way around it, because metabolism and mitochondrial function are so central to the function of cells. There is almost no way around it. Ultimately, all roads lead to mitochondrial dysfunction as the source of the dysfunction in brain cells.
Okay, so let's talk about the mitochondrial dysfunction and where that's coming from, because you said there's different layers. Let's first talk about inflammation pertaining to, if it's right for you, insulin resistance. Can you talk about how that disrupts the mitochondria and therefore the brain?
So again, all of these can become long, complicated stories, to be honest. And I know so many people like really simple stories. And so the simple version of insulin resistance, especially in some people in our community maybe, is that carbohydrates cause insulin resistance, and then insulin resistance causes mitochondrial dysfunction and causes everything else. That is one version. And certainly there are, I don't agree that like all carbohydrates in unprocessed forms from vegetables or fruits universally cause mitochondrial dysfunction, because we have good evidence that they don't. That people in China for millennia have been eating high carbohydrate diets in the form of rice, and many of them are perfectly healthy and can live long lives. So they are clear examples where one can eat high carbohydrate foods and be fine. But in our modern environment in particular, if we're going to talk about highly refined carbohydrates, if we're going to talk about sugars, if we're going to talk about ultra processed foods that have myriad ingredients that are known to disrupt mitochondrial function, that those types of foods can result in mitochondrial dysfunction and insulin resistance. And some people will get into disagreements about which comes first. I actually believe the mitochondrial dysfunction comes first, and that insulin resistance is actually a symptom of mitochondrial dysfunction. But then insulin resistance, again, it's a circle. Insulin resistance then causes even more mitochondrial dysfunction, because insulin resistance is really about fuel sources for cells and primarily related to glucose. So if you have insulin resistance, it means that you've got cells that are not getting enough fuel. And where is that fuel going? It's going right to the mitochondria. They are the ones primarily using those fuel sources. Cells can, in fact, produce ATP without mitochondria in a process called glycolysis. But let me be clear. If the mitochondria in your cells are not working right, like if they completely stop working, you're dead. Glycolysis does not save the day. Glycolysis is not sufficient to support cellular function. It's not sufficient to support life. I'm imagining a lot of your listeners already know this, but insulin resistance in the brain is increasingly understood to play a role in Alzheimer's disease, for example. But surprisingly to probably a lot of people, it's also known to play a role in numerous neuropsychiatric disorders, including schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, chronic depression, alcoholism, opioid addiction, other disorders. That glucose hypometabolism, that is the term most commonly used. Glucose hypometabolism is playing a role in all of those different disorders. And what that really means is that your brain cells aren't getting enough energy from glucose alone.
What is the connection with the food that we eat, then feeding insulin resistance and then mitochondrial dysfunction, or even the other way around, mitochondrial dysfunction feeding insulin resistance? What is that connection?
So some of the ingredients in the foods that we eat, like high fructose corn syrup, are known to be mitochondrial toxins. They are, and I use the word toxin maybe a little extremely because, there are other mitochondrial toxins like cyanide and arsenic. Those are mitochondrial toxins, and those are decisive toxins. They really kill mitochondria pretty quickly. And that's why we die pretty quickly if you get an overdose of arsenic or cyanide. So high fructose corn syrup does not compare to arsenic or cyanide. I'm not comparing the two. I'm not saying they are just as bad, because clearly people can eat lots of high fructose corn syrup and stay alive. But high fructose corn syrup is a mild mitochondrial inhibitor or toxin or whatever word you want to use. And it means that over time, it progressively impairs mitochondrial function. And that means over time, people can get progressive insulin resistance. And that means over time, people can get progressive brain dysfunction. And what does that mean? That means over time, if you're eating a lot of junk food that has a lot of high fructose corn syrup and a lot of other ingredients, not just that one, but a lot of other harmful ingredients, that over time, children, adults might begin to develop depression, anxiety, symptoms of ADHD, and even more serious mental health conditions like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. And why would that be? Because their brains aren't working properly. Why? Because their brains aren't getting adequate metabolism, which means their brain cells just don't have enough energy to work right.
I want to talk about the ketogenic diet as a solution to people that have severe mental health disorders and how that works. So I think people have heard about the ketogenic diet. Can you explain the mechanism by which you think the ketogenic diet works to help with mental health disorders?
Yeah, so it's kind of a controversial question because we know a lot of mechanisms of action of the ketogenic diet. And quickly, they include things like changing neurotransmitter activity or correcting imbalances, reducing brain inflammation, changing the gut microbiome that then affects the brain, changing hormone levels, so changing gene expression, better regulating glucose and insulin or reducing insulin resistance. All of those things are true. But again, how do all of those things connect? How can we connect all of those things? It's through mitochondria. So the ketogenic diet improves mitochondrial function in myriad ways. Ketones are an alternate source of energy or fuel for mitochondria. So that is one really powerful way. But ketones are also signaling molecules that result in a whole cascade of cellular events that ultimately lead to two processes with mitochondria. One is mitochondrial repair or mitophagy, where we're getting rid of defective mitochondria and replacing them with new ones. So that is one of the things, is we're getting rid of the bad mitochondria and bringing in new ones. And then the second thing is mitochondrial biogenesis, the production or creation of new mitochondria, so that when people have done the diet for a while, their cells will actually have more healthy mitochondria. And I believe that is actually the critical mechanism of action of how and why the ketogenic diet can help so many health conditions, not just brain conditions. And obviously, I'm a psychiatrist, I'm focused on the brain ones. It can help people lose weight, and it can help them lose weight in like easy ways. Like people will say, my appetite is so much easier to control. It's like I'm not hungry, I feel good, I have energy. It can help with diabetes reversal. You can actually get rid of your type 2 diabetes. People use ketogenic therapies for autoimmune disorders, for all sorts of things. But obviously, my passion is using ketogenic therapies and other metabolic therapies to help people with brain conditions, to help them improve their brain symptoms, and hopefully recover. Hopefully, like, put it into remission. Let's reverse it completely, put it into remission so that you no longer have this disorder.
I want to talk about ketones for the brain, because when you say ketogenic diet, people think of ketones. Do you have to register ketones in your urine or in your blood to have a therapeutic effect?
Well, so more than likely you have to do both. So if you're producing ketones, you'll end up, ketones get produced into primarily 3 different molecules: beta hydroxybutyrate, acetoacetate, and acetone. And those are measurable in blood, breath, and urine. And so it's all 3 are happening simultaneously. It's really hard to isolate just one of those processes. That usually when people are on any kind of a ketogenic diet and producing ketones, they're actually stimulating all 3. The blood monitoring tends to be more accurate, I will be honest. So if people are doing a therapeutic ketogenic diet, especially for a really serious health condition, I usually recommend doing blood monitoring if people have enough money to afford a blood monitor and the strips. The strips are usually about $1 a piece. So if you're monitoring a few times a week, that can start to add up for some people on some people's budgets. And if you can't afford that, that's okay. You don't have to. You can use the urine strips, which are much cheaper. And that at least gives you a sense of whether you're in ketosis or not.
And in terms of numbers that people should try to achieve, there are certain numbers that you spell out for something like, say, bipolar disorder and other health conditions. What are those numbers, certain keto numbers that people should aspire to get to?
So when people have pretty serious psychiatric conditions like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, I usually recommend that they aim for ketones somewhere between 1.5 and 3.0, blood ketones, 1.5 to 3.0, if they can achieve that. The ketones can go too high. I've had patients who are just too disciplined. They are really gung-ho about, like, I'm putting my bipolar disorder into remission, and they've gotten ketones in like the 6s. And sometimes that could be too high for some people, and you can actually get what is called ketoacidosis from that, and people can experience nausea, weakness, fatigue, and so sometimes just having them bring their ketones back down to like 3 or 3.5 or something can make a huge difference for them. So, but the lower limit of 1.5 is what I have consistently found to be kind of that lower threshold for a genuine, robust therapeutic response. that when people have ketones much lower than that, like 0.5, sometimes they'll get some mood improvement or some concentration improvement, but it may not be enough for resolution of psychotic symptoms or severe mood symptoms.
Okay, it's important to understand because I think people want to look for a certain number and they're trying to think, I need to register some ketones. What is the right number? So if people want to increase their ketones to have a therapeutic effect, that means that they should increase their fat. Is that correct?
So it really depends. So they're kind of 2 or 3 magic numbers, and they could all be playing a role. So the amount of carbohydrates is probably the primary driver of whether you're going to be in ketosis or not. So sometimes if they have low ketones, it's because they're eating too many carbohydrates. As a rule of thumb, I usually recommend less than 20 grams of carbs. Now, the carnivore people will say, no, let's go for 0 carbs. And then you'll really get robust effect. And that is true. You will tend to get higher ketones with 0 carbohydrates. And that may, in fact, be one of the reasons some people do well with the carnivore diet. There are other reasons, plants and all sorts of things that we could talk about, and the microbiome and effects on the gut and all sorts of theories around that. But that is one of them. So the first thing I usually look at when trying to help someone raise their ketones is the carbohydrate. The second thing I look at is actually the amount of protein they're eating. So if it's somebody who's really obese or overweight, I actually typically don't care how much protein they're eating. I let them eat as much protein as they want. And usually if they reduce their carbohydrates to less than 20 grams, that's enough. That's the problem solved. And they will be in high levels of ketosis, even if they don't eat a lot of fat. And why would that be? Because their body has so much fat on it that it can tap into. And oftentimes we want them to tap into that fat because they want to lose weight and they want to lose fat. And so that can be a way to stimulate fat loss, is by just low carb, reasonable protein, or even high protein. And you can eat as much protein as you need to or want to. And again, that's trending more toward a carnivore-ish diet. But that can actually be transformational for a lot of people. As people become thinner and thinner, it becomes more difficult and challenging to get high levels of ketones because now they don't have as much body fat on them. And so your body actually protects the remaining fat. It does not want you to starve to death and lose all of the fat on your body. Now, bodybuilders know this, Lament, because when they're trying to go from 8% body fat to 7% body fat, they know that that's almost impossible. Whereas it's easy to go from 16% body fat to 15% body fat. It's not that hard. So most bodybuilders can tell you the story about how as your fat percentage goes down, it becomes increasingly more and more difficult to lose any more fat. Like your body just clings to it because it's trying to stay alive. Your body thinks that you're starving to death, and it's like saying, no, we're not giving this up anymore. So in those cases, when people are thinner, then they do need to increase fat, exactly what you suggested. Then in those cases, I would say you need to dramatically increase the amount of fat you're eating. And in the epilepsy world, they talk about ratios of ketogenic diet. It's like a 3-to-1 ratio diet or a 4-to-1 ratio diet. And those ratios really represent how many grams of fat to how many grams of everything else is a person eating. And so in those cases, you do just increase the amount of fat that you're eating.
Okay, I wanted to ask about something a bit extreme. Have you heard of fat fasts?
Yes, and I've prescribed them.
Really?
I have prescribed fat fasts for people in the past. Yeah.
Tell me.
Well, so fat fasts actually I don't know if it originated with Dr. Atkins, but he talks about fat fasts in his books. And he may have borrowed it from someone else, because for better or worse, Dr. Atkins was not the original low carb ketogenic diet. That goes back to the 1800s. So, Dr. Atkins doesn't get a fame for that either. But a fat fast is essentially only eating fat. It is, so it's people who may not want to do a water fast, because a water fast is the easiest way to get your ketones higher. Again, the challenge is you don't want people emaciated. So if people are starting to get too thin, but they need a ketogenic diet for a therapeutic reason, then I would tend toward a moderate protein, high fat, very low carbohydrate diet. And a fat fast is kind of the extreme version of that. I usually don't recommend it because you are officially eliminating protein for a short period of time, which I don't like to do. Because when you eliminate protein, people are going to start losing muscle mass. There's no way around it. They'll have to lose muscle because your body needs a certain amount of protein just to maintain cells. And so it'll eat your muscle in order to do that. And it's hard to build muscle, as we all know. So you just don't want to lose what you've got. But a fat fast essentially is, I usually wouldn't recommend it for more than several days. But it is essentially only eating fat. And that it's not really appetizing even, but
I've tried it. It's terrible. I say it's not terrible, but I actually vomited on day 2.
That's pretty bad. It's
too much fat.
Yeah, no, and it really is. You're eating butter and oils or lard or other things, so it's not going to be really all that appetizing.
Okay, I wanted to ask as a final question, other, I guess, neurotoxins or things that damage the brain. I want to talk about trauma and social isolation. But firstly, I think this is something that people know, alcohol. How does alcohol affect the brain, and why is it even more potent on a ketogenic diet?
So, good question. So, alcohol is now very well known for many decades to be a mitochondrial toxin. And it is more toxic than the ultra-processed food toxicity that I described. Less toxic than arsenic and cyanide. So again, all of these things are relative. So when I say toxin, I am not saying alcohol is like arsenic or cyanide. But alcohol is in fact a mitochondrial toxin. It is converted into different things. So on good days, it gets converted into acetoacetate, and then that gets converted into acetate. So acetoacetate is actually toxic to mitochondria. And if you binge drink, meaning drink more than 3 or 4 drinks in one sitting, and I don't mean drinks from a glass, I mean the standard serving sizes, unfortunately, folks. So that means if you have a big martini glass and it's filled, that might actually be 4 to 6 drinks on its own. That one big martini in the extra big glass. So if you drink probably more than 4 drinks in one sitting, that's considered binge drinking. And the reason that's important is because your liver can't process the alcohol fast enough. And so acetoacetate levels start to rise, and then those begin to poison mitochondria. And mitochondria actually immediately, under microscopes, researchers can see this. The mitochondria start changing shape. Some of them actually start kind of almost blowing up. They expand and then they disintegrate. And so it really is toxic to mitochondria, and over time it can take a toll. The acetate story gets really interesting and complicated quickly, but that's research done by this world famous researcher, Dr. Nora Volkow, who's the director of NIDA. And it turns out then when people drink alcohol frequently, their brain cells actually start running on acetate. And then when they don't have alcohol in their system, they have glucose hypometabolism. That the mitochondria or the cells somehow become primed to primarily use acetate and use less glucose. And or it's just that the mitochondria are being poisoned, which is actually what I believe is probably happening. And so you get insulin resistance as a result of the mitochondrial toxicity. And so that happens. And in fact, we see that in alcoholics. Alcoholics are more likely to develop type 2 diabetes, for example. Not because they're drinking carbs or eating carbs or drinking carbs, but because of the toxicity of alcohol, which we know is toxic to mitochondria. Did that answer your question? I got too tangential.
It answers the question because I think that even people, if they do low carb or ketogenic diets, they're still going to have some alcohol. And I found it so fascinating that when you have alcohol in a ketogenic diet, it is more potent. So you have to be extra careful with having alcohol when you're lowering the carbs and increasing the ketones because of that byproduct effect of alcohol. So it answers the question. In the interest of time, last question for you, promise. Trauma and social isolation, because I want to make it clear that mitochondrial dysfunction is not just from food, it is also from environmental things. So how does trauma, past trauma, and then social isolation affect the mitochondria, then leading to brain damage and disease?
So this is a really important question. And there are numerous researchers studying this now for decades. And it really starts with this observation that people who have had, that I think we have the best scientific data, epidemiological data, outcome data on people who have adverse childhood experiences, commonly called ACEs. So these are children who are physically or sexually abused, whose parents get divorced, whose parents have drug addiction or mental illness, who experience homelessness, other things. So we know from large studies, massive studies, that the more ACEs you have in childhood, the more likely you are to develop a whole broad spectrum of mental illnesses, including PTSD, depression, anxiety, personality disorders, eating disorders, substance use disorders, suicidality, dementia, all sorts of things. But interestingly, people who have a lot of ACEs, the more ACEs you have, the more likely you are to develop obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and premature mortality, metabolic disorders. So people who have ACEs are more likely to develop mental and metabolic disorders. And we call those the social determinants of health when we're talking about physical health outcomes. And then we separate them and say, well, it's just mental health because of, of their trauma and experience. But many researchers have really been interested in how does that work? How does that work biologically? How does trauma in childhood result in a higher risk for obesity? How does it result in a higher risk of type 2 diabetes? Because sometimes people develop the pre-diabetes before they are overweight. It's not always that they become overweight first. The pre-diabetes sometimes starts before they are overweight. And then the weight starts to come on, especially if they end up going on diabetes medicines. So researchers have been exploring this. And again, the reason that I am so committed to the metabolic theory of mental illness is because increasingly all of these researchers are led to mitochondria. That stress and trauma directly impact metabolism, and that is through this fight or flight system that we have. So when we talk about activating the fight or flight system, we're really talking about changing metabolism. Your heart rate's going up. Your blood sugar is going up. Your blood pressure is going up. Why? Because your body is getting ready to run or fight or do whatever it needs to do to survive. And that means you need metabolic resources. That means like we need energy. We need lots of energy and we need it now. And it's, and it's emergency. It's a war. Like, let's go. When that happens chronically over time, unfortunately, it takes a toll. It takes a metabolic toll, and it can actually result in mitochondrial harm or mitochondrial dysfunction. And then over time, that increases your risk. The more mitochondrial dysfunction you develop, the more likely you are to develop obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and essentially all of the mental disorders in DSM.
So, as a solution to that, if somebody already has previous trauma, because I think people are thinking, well, what can I do about it? I've already gone through it. Apart from psychotherapy and all those other therapies, can eating fat help calm the system at all? Is there any way to explain that?
Yes, it can. And so, and you asked me about my personal story, and I'll just reflect on myself. For many, many years, I actually never really thought of myself as having gone through any trauma or trauma survival. And only in the last few years have I really thought, wait, I was homeless for a while. I left home before I finished high school. I was trying to commit suicide. I was bullied and teased relentlessly. I was I really felt like I had no friends. Maybe I had a little bit of trauma. maybe I count as having a little bit of trauma.
And you're smiling as well, and saying it. When I'm hearing it, it just touches my heart because I just think it's like I just can't imagine going through that if that makes sense, because it's just an incredible story.
Well, I'm in a much, much better place now. And that's why I can laugh about it or joke about it. And, for other people who have gone through similar experiences and aren't there yet, I certainly don't mean to be insensitive to your pain or suffering. I hope that you can get to a better place where you can someday at least not take it as seriously because you are in a better place. You feel good. You feel recovered. You feel safe. You feel valued and respected. And you can, whatever, make light of it. But I use myself as an example because I am kind of a perfect example of somebody who I probably had metabolic syndrome in my 20s, in part due to the adverse childhood experiences that I went through. That was part of the equation for me. And diet made a huge difference for me. So, I know that a lot of this triggers a lot of people. A lot of people think that I'm being flippant or insensitive to their trauma or their suffering when I even raise the possibility that a diet might play a role in their treatment. And again, it's not that you were on a bad diet and that's why you got abused. It's not that you were on a bad diet and that's why you have a mental illness. It's not that you were on a bad diet and that's why you developed prediabetes even. It's that you had trauma and you didn't do anything wrong at all. You experienced trauma. So unfair, so wrong, so evil, so whatever you want to call it. Nobody deserves that. You didn't deserve that. And then when Chris Palmer comes along and says, maybe a diet could help, they think you're blaming me even more, because they assume that I'm implying that they must have been on a bad diet before. And that's not what I'm saying. Instead, what I'm saying is I want you to follow the science as you and I have just discussed. that the trauma impacted these critical organelles in your cells called mitochondria, and they caused them to become dysfunctional. And now so much of your suffering is due to their dysfunction, that they are dysregulated or malfunctioning, and that results in your brain malfunctioning, and that results in you being depressed and anxious and hyper startling and unable to sleep and all of the symptoms that you're having. And one strategy, it's not the only strategy, and I don't want it to be the only strategy. One part of your comprehensive treatment plan might be thinking about dietary interventions. Now, might you use psychiatric medications? Yes, you might. Might you do psychotherapy? Yes, of course. Might you do other relaxation techniques and other things? Of course. But if those things aren't working and you're still looking for more solutions, you absolutely should at least understand that a dietary intervention like a ketogenic diet might play a profound role. It doesn't mean that diet had anything to do with causing the problem, but it does mean that a dietary intervention might be a powerful way to address the problem and to help you heal and recover.
Absolutely. It's interesting how people can make connections with things. So if you say change your diet, they might think, oh, did I have a bad diet? But I think it's important to understand the whole picture in terms of how what we eat plays a role, psychotherapy plays a role, other therapies play a role. It's not just a one size fits all, but these all can help with helping with overall mental health conditions. Dr. Palmer, thank you so much for your time. It's been incredible. If people want to hear more, where can they find you?
So I have two websites, brainenergy.com, and I also have chrispalmermd.com. So you can find me at either website. I've got articles and other podcasts that we've done and all sorts of things, news things, advocacy. If you want to join our movement, we're trying to transform the mental health field. So much work to do. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to leave all the links for those two websites and your book in the description of this episode so people can just check it out. But Dr. Palmer, thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure we're going to see you very soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining me on this episode with Dr. Chris Palmer. You can find the full show notes, including books, free resources, and journal articles at the Primal Labs. There is a link in the description of this video. If you're learning from and enjoying these free episodes, please hit the subscribe button. That is an excellent zero-cost way to support this free health podcast. If you love this episode, you'll also enjoy another episode I did with Dr. Ray Dorsey. Dr. Ray Dorsey is a specialist in understanding brain diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and also dementia. He'll talk about the main causes of Alzheimer's, dementia, and Parkinson's and why they don't start in the brain and the environmental toxins that we need to avoid. Finally, thank you for your interest in root cause healing, and I'll see you next week.